Uh, Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Uh, Hello, Ms. Odell. Hello, Somaliland Heritage. Hello, Edna. And hello, Abd Fattah. And whoever else is listening. Yeah, well, you spoke about several topics, and we can delve into all of them even further. I know you touched on a lot of things and a lot of information regarding those topics. Um, But yeah, we share the same views, absolutely. And it's so strange how the UN doesn't see Somaliland, um, and how it sees Somaliland as part of Somalia. And in there, if it hadn't met the United Nations, if I just pretend to be the United Nations, all they will say is, um, this Somaliland you're talking about existed only for 5 days. In their eyes, this is how they see it. They see it as this Somaliland only existed between June 26th and July 1st. And even so, in those 5 days that it did exist, um, this independence you're talking about is not registered as Somaliland. It's registered as Somalia. So those documents that you mentioned, those 5 treaties that Somaliland signed with the UK, it it was submitted to the United Nations not by Somaliland, but it was submitted by the UK because they have to, by law, submit those treaties to the UN. They did it on the same day, even though the UK actually signed those documents on the 24th of June. They submitted it on the 26th of June to the United Nations. So what happened when it was sent to the United Nations was the United Nations at the same time, simultaneously, were getting letters sent to them by Fakash Somalia. Somaliland never at that time sent any letters or documents to the United Nations because they, in all honesty, wanted to merge or join or work with or collaborate or any of these adjectives you want to use with Somalia at that time. So what happened was, once they sent those documents, submitted those documents on 26th of June to the United Nations, AK became part of the treaty letters and treaty accords of the United Nations, where they put all the treaties between 1960 and 1970 for that decade. They put all these documents submitted on file. What happened in that same year, in 1960, in September, was those 26 June documents that was sent by the UK of Somaliland's independence was then registered at the UN. So on 26 June, it wasn't registered at the UN, but it was submitted to the UN by the UK. It only got registered in September of that same year, 1960. And the registration, it says the signatories are the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Somalia. It doesn't say the signatories are Somaliland and the UK. It says the signatories of those 5 treaties are Somalia and the UK. Even though in the documents you can see who the signatories are, it was Egal and 4 other people, and it was some guy called T. Bromley, who was at that time the foreign representative of the Queen. Anywho, why did the UN then register those 5 treaties as Somalia and the UK? Because in between June 26th and September 20th, when that registration happened, was a lot of communication from Somalia, one of them being admission to the United Nations. So they saw only documents from Somalia, one-sided documentation, one-sided biases, one-sided supporting evidence for this so-called Republic of Somalia, which didn't exist before that date. And for the UN, even if you go to the UN now and you say, hey, this was submitted in error, their defense is going to be very simple, even though it's not based on law. They're just going to say, well, why are you complaining 65 years later? It doesn't matter about the time. I know law is law. It doesn't matter if it happened 5,000, whatever years ago. Even Yehuda today, they claim about 3,000 years ago it was promised this land or whatever, and people fall for that. I'm just saying, they're going to say, where was this? How come you had no representation of whatever information you stated for 65 years? And to be honest, it is embarrassing that Somaliland didn't write anything in the 1960s, that Somaliland didn't apply themselves for a UN seat in 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1980, 1985, 1991. They never applied for a UN seat. The earliest time Somaliland actually applied for a UN membership seat was in 1993, and it was a gal who applied for a seat, but he didn't even then follow the legal protocols of applying for a UN seat. He tried, but he didn't. Okay, so I say that only because in 1991, South Korea applied for a UN seat in 1991. Once North Korea, who they are the same ethnicity, they're both Koreans, um, they have different cultures, different dialects, but they are ethnically both Koreans. In 1991, when South Korea applied for UN membership, North Korea instantly, in the same year, applied for UN membership. Their application was very simple and straightforward. All they said was, the South Koreans cannot represent all of Korea. We have to have our own seat. And
Wow, I think that point is very important if we can elaborate when it comes to Somaliland. The world, we heard one of UK's House of Lords, he was assuming that, since the world anticipated that Somali Republic, he assumed that the UN seat belongs to both Somaliland and Somalia and is a 50-50. But how do we tell the world actually Somaliland is not represented anywhere? So when you see Western powers, whether it's America or the UK, continue to reiterate or continue to say is a Somali issue and it's for Somali people, assuming there's a legitimate union and there's a Somali republic, but don't actually realize that not only are Somaliland is not represented in the UN, Somaliland has no representation in the African Union, has no representation in the Arab League, no representation in the Islamic I don't know, there's one, whatever the Islamic one is, these kind of international platforms where you're able to express your needs or complaints with other governments, Somaliland is not presented. How dangerous is it that they unknowingly, how say it, especially with it being the 4th of July, America was a big push on decolonization, but again, are unknowingly supporting Somalia's occupation. They're supporting a genocidal entity, an entity that committed a genocide and illegal occupation. There are, America and the West seems to be supporting that without knowing the full story of what happened. How could you kind of talk about that a little bit, and then we move on. We'll have to move back to China.
yeah. I mean, first of all, like when 1991, when South Korea applied for a UN seat, and the North Korean immediately contested it, literally immediately, within like a month, they contested it immediately and said these people cannot represent all Koreans, especially North Koreans. It's unfair, unjust, and it's not going to be basically the right thing to do legally because they're not here. This worked for them because they did it immediately and it was still fresh on the minds of the organs of the UN and the rest of the world. So because that topic was ongoing, because the South Koreans applied for a seat, because there had to be when you apply for a seat, the UN Security Council have to look over the facts, the figures, the information, then give a recommendation to the rest of the United Nations General Assembly, over 100 and whatever 90 countries, and they can't give a flawed recommendation, so they have to take everything into consideration. So they did that, and it happened instantly. With Somaliland, it's now 65 years later. Okay, that's whatever. Statute of limitations probably doesn't apply, but still, 65 years later. Another thing is, if Somaliland uses the same argument as North Korea, by the way, our cases are completely different because we're not homogenous like Koreans. We're heterogeneous, so which means we're completely different. Even using the word heterogeneous is not even right because we're not even similar. It's like comparing, I don't know, gardening to what's it called, a space rocket. You know, it's you can't even compare the two things. We can't compare Somalilanders ethnically to whatever uh, is going on in Somalia because we're just different on every capacity, ethnically, racially, you name it. So for us to say, hey, this UNC does not even represent Somalis, all Somalis, we're already conceding the fact that we are Somali. So it's very difficult. We've allowed it for this to happen for 65 years. So by us,
But Wilder, if I could just stop you for a minute, when you say we've allowed it, we understand that Somalia's the president was from Somalian, the vice president was from Somalian as well. We understand there's been a 30 years occupation, which also included genocide, and it started. You know, you hear as early as 1960s. We have 1961. Somalilanders have been, you know, seeking their freedom and trying to get rid of occupational forces in Somalia, although although they have not been successful. But Somalilanders were, you know, have shown they're not interested in even the Somali Republic. If we're really being honest about it, Somalilanders, it might have been a push by Somalilander politician, but it was never something that Somalilanders wanted. Hence why there is no Article 102 of a union. It didn't go through. Somalilanders never wanted it, and there's no union that's ever happened. And this is why Somalia, the only thing they could do was an occupation of Somaliland, and obviously then led to a genocide. I understand for 30 years we couldn't do anything. When you look at, what was 31 years, so you look at from 1960 to 1991, even the time the president of Somaliland, Egal, was arrested and was put into prison. So you can see that this was a clear occupation. We can go even further down, you know, in 1960, they've taken away all Somaliland's army and have moved them to Somalia and brought in their own army to Somaliland, which is a military occupation, is an indication to a military occupation. But if we could move back to the topic in terms of, if we can just focus on what are the effects, like, you know, Somaliland's legal case, and you know, people could sit here and say, we are the same people. People could say people from Bahrain and Qatar are exactly the same people. But the fact of the matter is, Bahrain is an independent state with independent borders. So is Qatar. So does the United Nations then have a right to take away our independence and our statehood and our borders and everything just because we've been occupied for 30 years and we did not say anything? There's a failure. There's a certain failure by our current governments from 1991 onwards. They completely failed the Somalilanders. I agree with you on that point. But should we be punished as Somalilanders? Because, you know, when you talk about union, the United Nations specifically specifies that it is the will of the leaders and the nation and the people that they represent. The people have always stated that we're not interested in anything like that. And even when it comes to a union, it's never, there's no, I mean, I don't know why I'm even discussing a union, because there's no 50-50. We are not represented anywhere. We have been erased. So should Somalilanders be punished for something that, you know, an occupation that has occurred 30 years ago now, 34 years ago now?
uh, to answer, obviously no, someone shouldn't be punished, but like, it's like, why would anybody like break their back for you if you're not like okay. So just to go on what you said, Mr. Odell. Nobody holds that view in the world that Somaliland was marginalized for 30 plus years, and Somaliland went through marginalization for. Nobody holds that view. Not even Somalilanders themselves hold that view. You can see how they're speaking now. Our representatives is very challenging. What we can do to answer your question is what can we do now as Somalilanders and as Somaliland activists is we have to break the foundation. Literally, there's so many layers to this. It's just so immense. Like, we have to break the foundation, the very bottom. What is the very bottom? What is actually happening? And you guys have been discussing it now, which is the UN seat is the foundation, literally the foundation. Everything else, if we distract ourselves, I know it's bad and I know it happened, but I think the foundation is the first thing we need to destroy. The world and the United Nations and every country classify you as a Somali, and they classify you as the same origin as that person in Mogadishu. They classify that seat is representative of all of you. They classify you as being a breakaway. They classify you as being a secessionist, and all of this stems from again this United Nations application and Somaliland's lack thereof. This union that gets mentioned as well is you have to understand why isn't the union ratified? Why isn't it not ratified? You have to ask yourself, how come it's not ratified? How come it's not in law? The simple answer is, and the truth is, Somalia did not want to ratify this union, because if it ever ratified this union, it would show in black and white that an independent nation signed uh, uh, with a UN trust territory nation, and that this UN trust territory could not gain independence and could not gain statehood without merging or joining a independent nation. It would show that in black and white. So if ever, whatever happened now, it'd be in black and white, and then it'd be so easy for Somalilanders to say, look, these people were not even functioning back then, and we don't want to be part of this. We'll let them go on their own. You guys can do whatever you want with this former UN trust territory nation, and Somaliland is going to revert back to its independence. This is what the Somalians were avoiding. They did not want to show that in law, so it was not ratified because they did not want to ratify it. Somalilanders wanted to ratify it. Somalilanders filled out all the whatever. But to answer your question, Odell, about what can we do now about it, is we need to challenge this UN narrative. The United Nations, they genuinely do not know. What we used to speculate that the UN had a part to play in it, that the UN did this deliberately. To be honest, they just followed, because they're an organization, they just followed what other nations wanted to submit. Tunisia submitted recognition of a so-called Republic of Somalia. The UK submitted recognition of a so-called Somalia, and Italy sent recognition of a so-called Republic of Somalia, and they then proposed for this so-called Republic of Somalia to be granted admission to the United Nations. The United Nations as an organization just followed its procedure and policies of let's put this country forward. The errors that the United Nations did after then was they did not verify what this Republic of Somalia actually is. It did not verify what is the jurisdictional boundaries of this Republic of Somalia. It did not verify what is the does this Republic of Somalia fulfill the requirements of statehood. It just went on the supporting letters of three countries. And by the way, those three countries, one of them being Italy, being the administrator of this United Nations Trust Territory, the UK being a permanent Security Council member, and Tunisia at that time being a non permanent Security Council member. In July of 1960, um, Tunisia was a non-permanent Security Council. So these three countries were actually like heavyweights for the United Nations in this somaliA affair. So they just followed whatever those three countries said to them as an organization. They just followed those procedures. They didn't do their due diligence. We later found out through research that the United Nations, after actually granting admission to Somalia at the United Nations in September, in October of 1960, of November of 1960, of December of 1960, of January of 1961, those 4-5 month period, the United Nations Secretary General was sending letters to the so-called provisional president of Somalia saying, hey, send us what you signed with this act of union. Send us the ratification of this act of union. Send us what is actually making you a state. They realized, the UN at that time, that what they did was in error after the fact. So in that period, they was just pushing Somalia to actually provide legal and legislation about this so-called union, active union, which then led to Somalia in January 31st of 1961 to create an act of union law, which they then said is in retroactive basis based on July 1st. The Secretary General of the UN at that time was that Dam Hammarskjöld. I think he was Norwegian. Or was he Swedish? I think he was Swedish. Yeah, I think he was Swedish. He was the second United Nations Secretary General. He just thought, you know what, let me just push this forward. He just accepted that 1961 Act of Union law. And he used that to justify the errors that the UN did in September 1960. What happened is, look at this qadr of Allah. 3-4 months later, that Secretary General of the United Nations, he was flying over Congo, because I think at that same time there was big problems going on in DRC. His plane was shot down. They shot his plane down. I don't know who shot his plane down. I don't know what happened, but that Secretary General actually died like 3-4 months later of that era of him accepting the Act of Union law. You can even Google it, Dam Hammarskjöld. They have like statues of him in the United Nations. People still, the library of the UN is named after him. He was like, they don't know that error that he did in that period, because he's remembered for trying to make peace all around the world. But it just showed at that period, I think if Somaliland at that time challenged all of this legally, or challenged all of this to the UN, they would have we would be in a different position now. But sorry, but to answer your question, what can Somalilanders do now is to challenge the UN, literally, because the UN don't know what actually happened. They don't know that error that they did in September
Absolutely.
1960.